Hello, everyone. This is the second day of the Geographies of Alternative Care conference. My name is Miriam Tola. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Lausanne. Thank you for being with us today. I'm just going to say a few things about the conference to introduce today's roundtable and to introduce our moderator. First of all, this conference is generously supported by the Institute of Geography and Sustainability and the Interfaculty Platform in Gender Studies at the University of Lausanne. So thank you to EGD and Plage for that. I want to introduce the other members of the organizing team, since this conference is very much a collective effort. So the members of the organizing team are Marianna Fernandez, Christophe Maguire, Simone Ranocchiari, and Silvia Wozniewski, who are all here, and our student assistants who have been doing an amazing work. Thais Hobby and Luisa Malatesta, and if you could please just say hi to everyone. I think it would be nice if people would see who you are. Great. So this Today International Conference focuses on the multi-dimensional geographies of alternative care. In organizing this conference, we built on a long genealogy of feminist, anti-racist, and queer scholarship of care, from Marxist feminists who identified care labor as crucial site of gendered exploitation, to Black feminists who have long reclaimed self-care as a political tool in context of governmental neglect of racialized bodies, to queer and trans scholars and activists who have framed practices of collective care as essential for their survival in private and public spaces that are often inhospitable. So as we draw on these genealogies for today's roundtable, we have invited a range of speakers to engage with these genealogies and to discuss their potentials, but also their limits, also to problematize them for interpreting and transforming the current dominant modes of distributing care, namely the neoliberal models of distributing care. And of course, we also invite speakers to interrogate care as a feminist, anti-racist, and queer concept, and to problematize it, and to figure out whether in this very particular political moment when COVID-19 has highlighted the power struggles for the distributions of care, this concept can be actually useful, and in what ways. So I want to thank our moderator, who is really much more than a moderator. I consider Eleonore Lepinar very much as a fourth speaker here. And I want to introduce Eleonore, who is an associate professor in gender studies at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lausanne. Her main area of research are in the fields of feminist movements and theory, gender and law, intersectionality, and gender and political representation. Eleonore is the author of several articles and books on these topics. I just want to mention her two most recent books, which are Intersectionality in Feminist and Queer Movements, Challenging Privileges, that was published by Routledge in 2019, and was co-written with Elizabeth Evans. And Eleonore has a new monograph titled Feminist Trouble, Intersectional Politics in Post-Secular Times, that was released by Oxford University Press this year. And in this book, Eleanor actually engages with the feminist ethics of care. So I would like to welcome Eleanor and start our roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for your very kind introduction. So it's really, so hi, everybody. People I see, people I don't see, unfortunately. So it's really a great pleasure to be here. And I thank Miriam for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to know that we have a new addition at the University of Lausanne, a new feminist, a new radical feminist in our ranks. And it's always like a great news. So I'm really happy. We haven't had the chance to meet since Miriam just arrived in the midst of like COVID. But I'm looking forward to like real meeting at some point. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for this roundtable, as you've probably seen on the program, and I'm going to introduce them. Before I introduce them, just for the participants and who are following the seminar. So we will have at least, hopefully, half an hour of Q&A. And I ask you to use the Q&A box chat, not that you have on your Zoom, at the bottom of your Zoom. There is already actually one question for everybody. I do hope that some of what Miriam just said and some of what the panelists are going to say is going to answer that question about why alternative care. I guess it really depends on the definition that you give of care and the kind of literature you're referring to when you use that. But so you can use that box, and there's two options. You can write down your question and I will read it to the panelists, or you can just write your name, and well, your name is going to appear, but like indicate that you want to ask a question orally. And then it will enable us, when it's time for your question in the queue of the question, to unmute your mic so you can ask your question orally if you prefer. Also, before I introduce the panelists, I want to thank the interpreters who are interpreting in, I think, 3 languages. Well, not the same person, 3 languages, obviously, but 3 different interpreters. And you have also that options in your Zoom, since we will have 2 talk in English and 1 talk in Spanish. You can use that function if you're not fluent in both languages, which is probably the case of many people. Okay, so let me introduce the speakers. So first to speak is going to be Pamela Oeneniako. So Pamela, hi. It's very nice to meet you. Well, meet you, we've met before, but like to see you actually. So Pamela is doing her PhD in history at the University of Geneva on transnational Black women activism in Europe. And we're really looking forward to having that PhD out and in a book, because as you know, it's totally overlooked part of history. And so we really need to have that work available for discussion, and like, yes, new also doing the memory work of documenting all this activism. And Pamela is also the founder and the animator of Afrolit, which is a platform about Black literature. And I encourage you to look at it and listen and watch the interviews that she does with lots of prominent Black writers and African writers. And it's fascinating, and it's absolutely a great, it's a little gem to enjoy. So, so Pamela will be our first speaker. She will talk about women's epistolary exchanges as transnational practices of self-care. And I will not give more details about the content because she will do so in a minute. Our second panelist is Amaya Perez Orozco. And Amaya is an economist from, she has a PhD from the Complutense Universidad in Madrid. And she has worked on at the UN International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women. She has a book out in Spanish, Subversión Feminista de la Economía, certainly something we need right now in this economy. And she has done fascinating projects in Spain about like bioeconomy in Spain, in particular of egg procurement or donation, quote unquote, and the domestic economy in Spain, reframing them, locating them within the global care chains. And I think she might mention those projects in her intervention. Our last speaker will be Jamie Hakim. He's a lecturer in media studies at the University of East Anglia. He has a book, a monograph out, Work That Body, Male Bodies in Digital Culture, at Rowman and Littlefield in last year, published in 2019. And he's also right now working on an ERC project entitled Digital Intimacies, How Gay and Bisexual Men Use Their Smartphones to Negotiate Their Cultures of Intimacy. And he is a member of the CARE collective with 4 other scholars, Andreas Chatsidakis, Joe Littler, Catherine Rottenberg, and Lynn Siegel, who have issued recently at Verso the CARE Manifesto. And I think some of his reflection that he's going to be sharing with us are linked to that work. So with no further ado, I leave the virtual floor to Pamela, who is going to share with us also a presentation on PowerPoint. And you have 10 minutes, Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for this presentation. Thank you to the whole organizing team, and especially to Miriam, with whom I was more in contact with. But thank you to all, and thank you to our audience, which I don't see as well, but hi. So my presentation today is going to focus on a more historical aspect of what I would rather consider as self-care. And what I find interesting in making these links is that nowadays we all see, and especially people who are into anti-racist activism or women's activism or LGBTQ, I mean, whatever activism you are in, right, whatever context you're in, we can all experience how important it is to be in contact, to build links with people, either friends, family, but also people who kind of share our activism locally or internationally. And for that, we nowadays use Zoom, WhatsApp, emails, and so on. So of course, these technologies are technologies that have been expanding for the last 20 to 10 or even recent years. So what is interesting for me as a historian is to figure out, like, because I work from the period of the 69 to 2001. And of course, in that period, technologies of communications were not the same. And that's the reason why I am today focusing on correspondence between women activists between the US and Europe. So what was also interesting for me in participating in this conference is that my own research looks at the adherence and production of internationalism between Black women in Europe from the late 60s to 2001. So I consider especially anti-racism and anti-sexism, right? And how that builds transnational links. So the idea or notion of care is not something that is central to my research. So it was for me an opportunity to analyze some of the archival data that I've been collecting through these new lenses, right? So, and in doing that, I have already been encountering some of the work that has been looking more about the emotional ties than rather care or self-care. So there might be other works done, I'm just not aware of it, but I know that from the literary corpus and research that I've been looking at directly focused on Black European women, these lenses or categories of analysis are not that prominent when it comes to historical analysis. I'm not talking about sociological or more contemporary work. And so what is interesting, so my focus today would be on the correspondence held from Black and white women in Europe to Audre Lorde, who was a Black lesbian feminist, poet, writer, anti-racist, anti-sexist activists who also traveled in Europe, in Africa, and in many other places, Caribbeans and etc. in the world. And so when it comes to looking at Audre Lorde's transnational legacies, there's one book that has been published recently in 2015, that of Bolaki and Burke, and it's an edited book where there are different accounts by women who have encountered Audre Lorde, but also of historians or social scientists who write about these encounters and how we can analyze them. And so in this book, there's one contribution by Tiffany Florville, who looks at the emotional connection between Black and white German women to Audre Lorde. So again, it's drawing from these emotional connections that I was also able to think about this idea of care in looking at the correspondence. So as I said, the data, I'm a historian, so the first data I use is archival material. This time it's written, it can also be oral. And it is the correspondence held at the Spelman College. So it's the private papers of Audre Lorde, which I held at the Spelman College in Atlanta. And due to many reasons, I did not go there. So the archives was sent to me. And so going through them, I'm looking at correspondence from Jackie Kay, who was a poet in the UK, Marion Kaf, Katharina Oguntoye, Maya Yim, who were Black German women, but also Rina Nissim, who was a white Swiss woman who's still alive and based in Geneva, Dagmar Schulz, who was a white German woman, and Gloria Wecker, you may know her. She's a scholar, a Dutch, Afro-Dutch scholar, and she has recently published on whiteness in the Netherlands. So I'm looking specifically at the correspondence that was done between 1984 and 1991. Audre Lorde died in 92. Out of cancer, and it is the correspondence from these women to Audre Lorde. So I do not read Audre Lorde's responses, or I do not analyze Audre Lorde's responses to their correspondence. And one thing that I'm drawing here, and that it's more related to an ethical question, is like, to what extent are these women aware that their correspondence is made available through these papers? That is something these papers have. I'm definitely not the first one to look at these papers, but going through them, I felt that some of the content was very personal. So I really was wondering, and other people before me were also wondering, to what extent are the women aware? So this is also something that I will have to make sure and contact those who are still alive before I make anything public. So just to understand the context of this correspondence, is the reason why there were these ties is because Audre Lorde traveled very frequently to Berlin, and from there she traveled to London, to Amsterdam, to Basel, where she got care for her cancer, to Zurich, where she gave talks, and to Geneva. Right, so from Berlin, where she had been invited by Dagmar Schulz, she decided, and she asked, to link with other women of color, especially Black women in Europe, in order to build ties, to learn from their experiences, etc. She herself was battling against cancer. So, and she's been battling for it since 78, and she had already published her cancer journals in 81. She also theorized not only on the importance of cross-border interactions between women across not only from the US to Europe, but also US, South Africa to Europe. So whatever transnational links were important, she definitely theorized and encouraged those, but also on the power of language, namely in her first, it was a speech, then turned into an essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, which was published in Sister Outsider. So these interactions, in some cases, created the ground for, but definitely stimulated the initiatives by Black or women of color in Europe to write collective books about their own narratives and positions and experiences in Europe. So here I put two examples. So Faber Bekennen, which was written by Black German women, but also edited by Dagmar Schultz, who was a white feminist, a radical woman, also lesbian, and Charting the Journey, which was published in '88 by women of color in the UK. And in these two books, right, we find women who have been in close interaction with Audre Lorde. So to say that it is because of Audre Lorde that these books emanated would be too given a lot of importance to Audre Lorde, but she definitely played a role in promoting women, both straight and lesbian, to really write down the narratives of what it is to be Black woman and sometimes lesbian in Europe. So kind of localizing and grounding these narratives. So they already had, these connections had already been built through these women listening to Audre Lorde when she was giving speeches in Europe, or through reading reading her work, right? So this is the reason why we can explain why she held this correspondence with these women. And so when we draw a closer look to the content of the correspondence, so it's mostly accounts or comments on issues pertaining to women's liberation activism. Once again, these women, all of them called themselves women. So that's the reason why I'm not including trans identities or queer identities here. Some of them were lesbians, some not. So it was, but all of them were involved in the women's liberation of the late 80s and early 90s. Most of them were also involved, whether they were of color, Black or white, in anti-racism from a position of either ally or concerned person. All of them were also dealing with political unrest. So if we look at the context of Germany, in 1991, it was the unification of the country, which sparked a lot of political unrest. But they also had information about the Gulf War, etc. So they really make these comments about this and this is happening as if they were journaling. So that's what I also find interesting, is this correspondence was more like holding a journal that was addressed to Audre Lorde, rather than, you know, maybe just wondering on how she was and how was family, etc. So they would really delve into their own thoughts and their own analysis of what was surrounding them. They would also talk about the different women they would meet during their travels, but also environmental issues, given the fact that at that point, especially in Europe, there was this, so there was of course Chernobyl, but there was also these acid rains. So really having this whole kind of holistic political understanding of what would trigger their well-being. So well-being here being understood as really what would make these people just experience life in a joyful, safe way. And these were the current issues that were really triggering unwell-being, let's say. And so then the need for some sort of care. And of course, there were also accounts of very personal and private information and a lot of poetry. So some of the poetry further got published, but these women would share their own poetry, own creativity with Audre Lorde, who was thus considered as a mentor. And of course, postcards, as these women were traveling. Some of them would also draw. So we can definitely see them sharing all that with Audre Lorde.
Pamela, I'm sorry, just to give you an indication of time, you have 2-3 minutes left.
Yeah, fine. I'm reaching the end. That's good. Thank you. So the reason why I consider this correspondence as transnational practices of self-care rather than care is, as I said, these women were writing these letters as if they were sharing their own thoughts and their own comments and perceptions of what was surrounding them. So of course, these letters always start with, you know, asking Audre Lorde how she felt, ending with, you know, asking her about family, etc. So probably she answered back, telling them about her own challenges and private life. But what is interesting is that these women really delve into explaining what triggers them and what concerns them. So I really read this correspondence like some sort of a personal journal that is addressed to a trusted person in the person of Audre Lorde. It is transnational in this idea that, of course, these women are all located in different countries, and they address their correspondence to someone who is familiar to these contexts to some extent. Audre Lorde, as I said, traveled to Europe, but also kind of external. So she's not directly impacted by the issues that are being presented. That's also why they go thoroughly through explanation and description of what is happening. So that is where there's a very interesting notion of how information and comments circulate through borders across correspondence. And of course, these women, as I said, were themselves writers, either writing their own narratives or also poetry writers. So there's a very strong idea of the act of writing, of being seated, as some of them were typing, some of the correspondence handwritten, of really putting into words one's feelings, one's emotions, one's comments, putting into words what may not make sense before it is put into words. So definitely, again, applying what Audre Lorde considered as the power of language and the power of how language transforms pain and unwell-being. And of course, in order to do that and for them to be so safe and to really sometimes delving into very personal matters, of course, it is addressed to a trusted person, but also as they are sharing their poetry, it is also acknowledging Audre Lorde as a mentor with experience. Again, she was an international reckoned poet. So it is also their way of sharing their own beginnings for some in poetry. So thank you for your attention. I'll be looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for very rich presentation. I know 10 minutes is a ridiculous amount of time. It's not possible to keep it. We'll try to do our best. So now I'm happy to give the floor to our next speaker. Amaya, are you ready? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Bueno, yo voy a hablar en castellano. Entiendo que no hay problema, ¿verdad? En primer lugar, dar las gracias a las personas organizadoras y a todas quienes nos estáis acompañando. Lo haré lo mejor que pueda para sintetizar en 10 minutos cuestiones tan gruesas como las genealogías del cuidado y los retos que nos presentan a futuro. Se nos pidió, a la hora de invitarnos a participar en esta mesa redonda, dialogar con un texto histórico, y el texto que yo he elegido es un texto de Cristina Carrasco, que es una economista feminista chilena que ha vivido muchos años en España. Es un texto que se llama La sostenibilidad de la vida humana, un asunto de mujeres, y que fue publicado en 2001. Lo he elegido porque considero que este texto fue detonante, dio inicio a toda una mirada hacia el sistema socioeconómico, una mirada feminista que yo diría es propia y paradigmática del contexto hispanohablante y que tiene en el concepto de sostenibilidad de la vida, digamos, su elemento, yo diría, aglutinador, que luego ha ido derivando a la noción de cuidados. Este texto planteaba dos elementos centrales. En primer lugar, lanzaba el planteamiento de la sostenibilidad de la vida, la pregunta de cómo estamos resolviendo la vida con sus necesidades, deseos materiales e inmateriales más allá de los mercados, lo planteaba como la principal propuesta analítica y política para descentrar a los mercados capitalistas y para sacar a la luz las dimensiones invisibilizadas del sistema que históricamente han estado en manos de las mujeres. Y desde esta idea de sostenibilidad de la vida, nombraba un conflicto estructural e irresoluble en el capitalismo entre los procesos de acumulación de capital y los procesos de sostenimiento de la vida. Y planteaba que este conflicto irresoluble se terminaba resolviendo en términos de dar prioridad a los procesos de acumulación a costa de delegar la responsabilidad de sostener la vida a las dimensiones invisibilizadas. En otros términos, que la mano invisible del mercado no era lo que sostenía la vida, sino lo que la estaba atacando, y que era la mano invisible de la vida cotidiana lo que permitía que pudiéramos seguir adelante como vida colectiva, digamos. Desde ahí se fue desarrollando toda una línea de construcción teórica, académica también, pero sobre todo de construcción política, que fue poniendo cada vez mayor énfasis en la noción de cuidados para nombrar esa mano invisible de la vida cotidiana. Y desde esta línea de pensamiento y acción, creo que se han hecho planteamientos con mucha fuerza. Yo querría rescatar tres de ellos. En primer lugar, el énfasis en la idea de vulnerabilidad, de no dar la vida por hecho, sino de plantear que la vida hay que reconstruirla día a día, porque la vida es siempre una posibilidad, pero no una certeza. Entonces, entender la vulnerabilidad como una condición básica de la existencia frente a la noción hegemónica y meritocrática de autosuficiencia, que decimos es solo accesible para los sujetos privilegiados y a costa de invisibilizar precisamente los cuidados que los sostienen. La idea de vulnerabilidad la hemos vinculado a las nociones de interdependencia y ecodependencia también como condiciones básicas de la existencia, ni buenas ni malas en sí mismas, simplemente son constitutivas del ser. Y desde ahí hemos denunciado que la interdependencia en el marco de este sistema se resuelve en términos de desigualdad y explotación y que la negación de la ecodependencia nos ha llevado a una situación de traslimitación, hemos ido más allá de los límites del planeta y de colapso ecológico. Y desde aquí se ha abierto un diálogo, una alianza muy rica con el ecologismo, con el ecofeminismo, con el antiextractivismo. El segundo gran elemento fuerte desde esta mirada de cuidados ha sido la idea de crisis de los cuidados, para denunciar que la vida estaba en crisis, aunque los indicadores de mercado no anunciasen una crisis. La primera mirada a la idea de crisis de cuidados fue más coyuntural, como algo nuevo, pero poco a poco nos fuimos preguntando, ¿cuándo la crisis de los cuidados no ha sido una realidad para las mujeres de clase obrera, para las mujeres del sur global? Más bien, la crisis de cuidados es constitutiva del sistema que pone la vida en riesgo. Y la idea de crisis de cuidados la hemos vinculado a la noción de cadenas globales de cuidados, que de nuevo, en un primer momento lo vimos como algo novedoso, que al norte global nos obligaba a analizar la raíz colonialista de nuestros sistemas. Pero de nuevo, en un segundo momento dijimos, eso es cierto, pero además es que los cuidados siempre se han resuelto en clave de transferencias desiguales entre las mujeres. Es decir, que la desigualdad interseccional no es nada nuevo, es algo ubicuo y estructural. Y desde ahí hemos planteado también renombrar el sistema que no es capitalista, heteropatriarcal, colonialista, racista, que es todo eso junto, decimos a veces para reducir y acortar esa cosa escandalosa. Y en tercer lugar, desde esta mirada de cuidados, hemos modificado, hemos reformulado las reivindicaciones políticas que han dejado de estar constreñidas a los mercados. Por ejemplo, hemos renunciado a la apuesta por la emancipación a través del empleo para más bien plantear que necesitamos abolir, terminar con el empleo, con el trabajo asalariado, porque lo entendemos como una forma de trabajo alienado que no cuida ni sostiene la vida. Entonces, para buen vivir, acabar con el trabajo asalariado. En otros términos, no solo hemos llevado una reivindicación política más allá de los mercados, sino en línea directa de ruptura con el sistema socioeconómico, con esta cosa escandalosa. Por eso decimos pasar de un sistema donde la acumulación de capital está en el centro a un sistema donde el cuidado de la vida, decimos a veces, esté en el centro. En otras palabras, otro mundo distinto donde todas las vidas en su diversidad importen en el marco de un planeta vivo. Entonces, ha sido una mirada muy potente. Querría resumir las potencias en tres elementos. En primer lugar, es una mirada muy potente porque pone siempre en primera línea de frente los cuerpos y la vida cotidiana. Y poner los cuerpos implica poner las marcas de desigualdad acumuladas a lo largo del ciclo vital y a lo largo de la historia. No podemos escaparnos de esta mirada a la desigualdad interseccional. Y en segundo lugar, pone siempre en el centro la vida cotidiana. Esto implica democratizar el conocimiento y el debate político, porque de la vida concreta todas podemos hablar. La segunda gran potencia ha sido esa capacidad de mirada sistémica. Desde la base misma del sistema miramos al todo del sistema, al conjunto. De alguna manera hemos trasladado al ámbito económico el planteamiento de que lo personal es político. Decimos, lo personal es político la vida cotidiana es económica. Y esta mirada sistémica es además una mirada desde el conflicto, desde la visibilización y el nombrar los conflictos multidimensionales. Nombramos un conflicto estructural capital-vida como un problema común, pero al mismo tiempo afirmamos que este problema común se aterriza en experiencias de vida radicalmente desiguales. Es un problema que nos une y que nos desiguala al mismo tiempo. Y aquí está el reto político, en construirlo como un problema común, abordando las desigualdades y los privilegios. Pero además de potencia, también ha tenido riesgos esta mirada, riesgos asociados a un sobredimensionamiento de la idea de cuidados, a un énfasis excesivo, a una mirada excesivamente puesta en la idea de cuidados, en detrimento de otros planteamientos y de otras miradas. Estos riesgos los querría resumir en 4. En primer lugar, es una mirada idealizadora, que sigue pensando los cuidados como algo bueno en sí mismos y que tiene mucha dificultad para sacar a la luz las dimensiones de control y de violencia que hay también en la experiencia cotidiana de los cuidados. Pero además es una mirada que piensa en los cuidados, que yo sí diría, hay cuidados mainstream, enlazando con la pregunta que planteaba antes una compañera. Entonces no termina de ver cómo los cuidados mainstream sí cuidan la vida y la sacan adelante, pero al mismo tiempo permiten que salga adelante malamente en el marco de un sistema que la está atacando. Dicho de otra manera, hemos perdido capacidad de ver el papel que juegan los cuidados para contener el conflicto. En segundo lugar, de acuerdo, Eleonor, 3 minutos. Es una mirada esencializadora. No logramos despegar los cuidados de las mujeres. No, como si fuera propio de una esencia femenina, como si existiese una esencia femenina. Entonces, no logramos construirlo como un problema político colectivo, ni logramos terminar de preguntarnos cómo el binarismo heteronormativo blanco es el régimen de política sexual de esta cosa escandalosa que queremos entender y enfrentar. El cuarto riesgo, a mi juicio, es la pérdida de esa dimensión de conflicto multidimensional. Perdemos dimensión de conflicto con el capital y el capitalismo, por ejemplo, cuando planteamos que la economía de los cuidados tiene que funcionar bien para que la economía de verdad, los mercados, vayan bien. Perdemos otras veces conflicto, capacidad de nombrar el conflicto heteropatriarcal y con los hombres, cuando, por ejemplo, compañeros de miradas críticas nombran el conflicto de los cuidados con el capital, pero no el conflicto cotidiano en la distribución de los tiempos de vida. O cuando utilizan el argumento de sus necesidades de cuidados para poner una vez más sus propias vidas en primera línea de los procesos colectivos. Y perdemos también capacidad para nombrar el conflicto entre las propias mujeres. Y esto lo vemos claramente, por ejemplo, en la incapacidad para poner una propuesta política sólida y contundente en los nudos críticos como pueden ser el empleo de hogar, el trabajo de hogar remunerado, que en un contexto hispanohablante tiene un peso central. Y el cuarto y último riesgo es el reduccionismo y la poca fuerza en clave de reivindicación política más concreta. Entonces, cuando intentamos concretar nuestras propuestas políticas, por ejemplo, cobran mucho énfasis propuestas de política pública en atención a la dependencia, en infancia o en conciliación, pero no logramos ver o plantear hasta qué punto el estado del bienestar nos puede ser útil, pero para desbordarlo, nunca para ser el horizonte, porque los cuidados invisibilizados y desigualmente repartidos son su base, porque su base es el expolio medioambiental y la explotación del sur global. Dicho de otra manera, porque el estado del bienestar es el intento de conciliar lo irreconciliable, de hacer vivir bien en el marco de un sistema construido sobre el conflicto con la vida. Entonces, terminamos en clave política lanzando un eslogan muy bonito, pero vacío, termino ya, que sería eso de la vida en el centro. Nadie puede contraponerse a poner la vida en el centro. La cuestión es de qué vidas hablamos y qué significa eso. Y con esto termino. Entonces, desde aquí, ¿qué hacer? Yo tengo preguntas, no respuestas, pero en clave de respuestas diría avanzar en 2 líneas. En términos analíticos, una mirada más amplia y articulada de conceptos que reduzca el peso de los cuidados y dé más peso a otros y buscar también conceptos nuevos, por ejemplo, que nos permitan distinguir cuidados mainstream de cuidados alternativos, y en clave política, hacer énfasis en la construcción de un sujeto colectivo que no dé por hecho el problema común, sino que lo construya atreviéndose a mirar las desigualdades y sobre todo desde las periferias de la experiencia de vida de las mujeres del norte global, blancas, urbanas, clase media, etc. Hasta ahí. Muchas gracias, Eleonor, y disculpa.
Gracias a ti. It was super, very rich. Lots of new questions, and also.
You're muted, Eleanor.
Sorry. No, I'm not. I'm not supposed to be muted.
No, you're not. We can hear you.
Thank you. So anyway, so also lots of ideas to go further about this concept,
Eleanor,
and its limits.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, but I can hear you. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's okay now? Yeah. Okay, no, it's fine. It always happens. It has to happen at least once.
Yeah.
So, Jamie, it's your turn now. So I'll give you the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you to everyone who's organised this. It's already been a really fantastic roundtable. Those two presentations were very rich and speak in lots of ways to the work that we're doing at the CARE Collective, interestingly. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name's Jamie Hakim, and I'm a member of the CARE Collective. And as Eleanor said before, I work alongside Lynn Siegel, Catherine Rottenberg, Joe Littler, and Andreas Hastidakis. We're an interdisciplinary group of academic activists who began to meet in 2017 as a reading group to discuss the multiple crises of care that were and are still engulfing the world. These discussions have culminated in our recently published The Care Manifesto, in which we argue that we need to reorganize our societies in accordance with the principle of what we call universal care, placing care front and center at every scale of life. So I joined the collective a little later than everyone else, at a point where they had been concentrating on work on motherhood and childcare. And one of the questions that had arisen by the time I joined was how might the group think of notions of care that were a little queerer than some of the heteronormative literature they had been reading. So I normally research questions of mostly queer intimacy. So the work that immediately sprung to mind related to the AIDS crisis. So today I'm going to talk about care in relation to the AIDS crisis, specifically the way that the grassroots organisations reacted to the spectacular failure of the traditional and often heteronormative arrangements of both caring for and caring about that were hegemonic at the time. And for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be concentrating on the US context in the 1980s and 1990s. So the AIDS crisis officially began in 1981, when a small clutch of gay men in the US caught rare diseases that suggested their immune systems were no longer working. By the end of that year, there were 270 cases of gay men with severe immune deficiency and 121 deaths. These numbers grew rapidly throughout the 1980s. And by 1995, the year the first effective medication was introduced, over 500,000 people in the US were living with AIDS, and over 300,000 had died. In 2017, 37 million people were living with HIV globally. What living with AIDS meant, particularly during the early years of the crisis, was the contraction of mostly rare cancers and pneumonias, and often dying very sudden and very gruesome deaths. Gay men were not the only social group to be affected by AIDS during this time, but the failure of care that I'm interested in did have a distinctive homophobic logic that discursively centered gay men during this moment of the crisis. For example, one of the major ways that the Western media and medical establishments frequently represented the origins of AIDS were in the deviant sexual practices of metropolitan gay male subcultures. This idea was a central node connecting neoliberal, homophobic, and religious discourses that blamed gay men as irresponsible individuals for contracting HIV. This enabled the Reagan administration to drag their feet when it came to providing the sort of state response that was necessary to match the scale of the crisis. Reagan didn't actually publicly mention the word AIDS until 1987, 6 years after the first cases were recorded. A frequent and very persuasive claim made by AIDS activists at the time was that the reason the state response was so negligible was precisely because the neoconservative president failed to care about gay men. And there was also a failure to care for. The AIDS crisis caught the medical establishment unawares. It was only until 1983 that it was understood that HIV was transmitted through semen and blood. Prior to this, medical staff wouldn't go near people living with AIDS or PWAs for fear that the virus might be airborne. The pace of infections meant that AIDS wards in hospitals in gay neighbourhoods were overfull with uncleaned and unfed patients. Throughout the AIDS crisis, regulations in these hospitals often dictated that only immediate family could visit dying patients. And this meant that lovers and friends who became the primary carers of PWAs if homophobic families had rejected them would lose contact with PWAs and not be able to enact their dying wishes during their final days. It's not hyperbole to say that the hatred spread by the media, combined with this abject failure of caring for and caring about by the state, the medical establishment, and often biological families, was devastating for people who were facing death in such gruesome, sudden, and often incomprehensible ways. So this brings me to ACT UP. ACT UP were one of many grassroots organisations that sprung up in the face of these failures. Formed in New York in March in 1987, ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, described itself as a diverse, non-partisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. Uniting previously disparate social groups, so gay men, lesbians, trans folk, second wave feminists, people of colour, IV drug users, ACT UP led a multi-pronged strategy to deal with this failure of care. In relation to media representation, they produced a range of visual media, from the iconic Silence Equals Death posters to videos that were broadcast on New York public television that presented counter-hegemonic discourses on the epidemic that opposed the homophobia dominating the media at the time. In relation to medical care, so in the absence of the state, ACT UP developed safe sex practices and educational materials. They played a major role in pushing for the speedy and effective trials of HIV/AIDS medication in the face of what they felt was the snail's pace of research being undertaken by the US medical establishment. ACT UP went into hospitals to care for people living with AIDS in the absence of proper nursing. So in relation to demanding that both the Reagan administration and society at large care about AIDS, ACT UP were geniuses of political spectacle, staging a series of direct actions that included highly mediated invasions of the New York Stock Exchange and the emptying of the ashes of cremated PWAs on the lawn of the White House. Now, one of the ways that I think it could be useful to make sense of ACT UP's work around caring is by turning to an essay that was written by one of its members, the curator and academic Douglas Crimp, called How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic. In this essay, Crimp critiqued the idea, advanced not only in the media, but also by gay leaders, that gay male promiscuity was at the root of the AIDS epidemic. Crimp countered this by arguing that the promiscuity of post-Stonewall sexual cultures meant that gay men multiplied experimental sexual practices beyond the penetrative sex that was the most common route of HIV transmission amongst gay men. He writes, open quote, "It's for this reason that some gay leaders perversely distorted insistence that our promiscuity will destroy us, when in fact, it is our promiscuity that will save us," end quote. As you might imagine, this was a contentious claim, but one that I think remains persuasive. So in the spirit of Crimp's article, we might call the multiplication and experimentation of forms of care beyond the state the market, and the family that ACT UP developed, promiscuous care. In the manifesto, we argue that when it comes to who and what we care for and how we do it, we must act in line with an ethics of promiscuous care, multiplying and experimenting with modes of caring for, about, and with, beyond the shriveled forms of care that are hegemonic today. What this means in practical terms is that our common sense needs to change around who should be caring for who and with what resources. We must normalize an egalitarian model of care where everyone can care for everyone and not just hyper-exploited, feminized and racialized subjects, and that a radically democratic state must resource these experimental caring arrangements. Childcare, elderly care and palliative care must be taken seriously and not treated just as commodities for neoliberal capitalism. We must proliferate and expand our circles of care beyond our families and those designated as our fellow citizens. And if we are to stop both the mounting refugee and environmental crises, reimagine the stranger and the non-human world as if they were kin. So as the Care Collective, we advocate for an ethics of promiscuous care as a first step in building the psychic infrastructure of a new society that has universal care at its heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie, also for keeping the time, which hopefully will allow us to have some time for questions. So what a brilliant panel. So many questions. And I think, so what I'm going to do only one round of questions. I'm going to have first kind of delineate, I think, kind of conceptual tensions or questions that I think kind of arise from the three panelists being together in this session, dialoguing, the kind of dialogues and a discussion that we can have between the various conceptions of care that you delineate explicitly or implicitly. And then I'll have one small question for each of you. So I'm going to try not to take too much time. I'm very bad at this generally. So one of the first tension that I see and that is inherent to the vocabulary of care, I guess, is that tension between the kind of metaphors we use, maybe between work and love. You know, there is this literature, especially, for example, in sociology, that really anchors what can be called care in more like emotional work, and that really looks at also at some of the point that Amaya raised in terms of like, it's also a care load. It is work to care for other. It has also economical implication, etc. And then on the other side, we also tend to like take care towards the idea of love. So something which is supposedly is outside of the market, outside of the economy, is not comparable to work in many ways. And so that leads, I guess, to the question of the kind of concept that we use, right? So we can use care. None of you has used social reproduction, but it used to be also a way to address those issues in a more Marxist perspective. And then Amaya mentioned the idea of sustainability of life. And here, I think it's really interesting to have that perspective from another kind of tradition in another language, because it shows that those conversations also sometimes have not been integrated towards with one another. And I was really, I think that the idea of sustainability of life, what it brings is this idea that care supports the neoliberal market in many ways, that market could not exist without it, which was also, I mean, kind of the idea behind social reproduction, but maybe not exactly in those terms. And here, I don't know if you're familiar, so I'm going to bring another tradition, which is the French tradition of moral psychology and ethics of care. Pascal Molinier has worked on what she calls the care world. So le care monde, so this idea that there is this kind of underneath invisible world that sustains our economy and our world. So I guess my question is, what type of concept seems to you the most useful, and what are the limits that you can see, or the tension that you can see in between those type of approaches. Another one has to do with where to locate care. So I'm not a geographer, but like I'm kind of taking up the challenge of being in a more kind of geography conference. And is it, you know, we talk about self-care. So should we locate it in the individual who gives it or receives it? Does care has to be located in a relation? And what type of relation is going to enter into that category? Is it a relation with proximate people, with distance, people very far away from us, very close to us? Like, so what's the perimeter of this relation? Should we locate it in institutions? You know, institution fighting against market, or like try to recuperate the state, or in collectives, political communities. So like, what's the scale of care, and where shall we locate it, or is it everywhere? So what would be your or in, you know, also global chains of care. And then a last more global point is, I find, so maybe I'm taking this back to my own interest or conceptual interest. There is, I mean, there is underneath, but maybe not so clearly in your talks, actually, in the three, the idea of responsibility. Who's responsible for whom, right? I think care also asked this question, but you did not like really totally articulate it. And I'm very interested in hearing more about that. Like, for you, how do we locate responsibilities for care? Because we don't have the same responsibility, all of us, to care in the same ways. You know, it depends on many social hierarchies. It depends on social structures, on the market economy. There's lots of things, but isn't that also a way to think about how care can be can help us, you know, transform the world as a like transformative project, to talk much more clearly, precisely about responsibilities to care, of whom towards whom. And then I have like three really short questions for each of you. So Pamela, I was actually, it's kind of a double question, but I was really curious because you didn't have time to maybe go into further details, but you did mention that, you know, some of our correspondents, of Audre Lorde's correspondents in Europe, were Black, some were white, some were lesbian, some I guess were straight, although I'm not sure about this. And so I wonder, in the type of address and language they use to talk to Audre Lorde, if you could find differences that are linked to this kind of more intersectional dynamic linked to sexuality or race. And then I had another question, which is, I guess, more about the concept of self-care, because there's a tendency to like understand that concept today, which I'm not sure I totally agrees with, very actually self-centered in many ways. But as you show, I think very interestingly, to do this self-care, they have to address someone else. So actually the relation is central to self-care. And I was wondering if maybe you had some thoughts about this, because I think it really pushes us to rethink what we think, how we conceptualize actually the self, and you know. And for Amaya, so I was really fascinated, such an articulate presentation of this whole tradition, and then a critique. It was very, very inspiring. And I wanted just maybe to have your thoughts, trying to, because since you came back to the idea of vulnerability, and Judith Butler has used that, but more in terms of like reflecting on the boundaries of the political community. And she's been, I mean, there's been a lot of discussions about how vulnerability can or cannot be used as this kind of litmus test, or I don't know, like criteria, or like that could help us redefine collectivities and political communities. And as you said at the end, there's lots of risks in like actually like kind of universalizing this idea of, you know, human vulnerability and of sustaining life. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you, how you think that idea of vulnerability might be, you know, what are the limits of the idea and how it can be used to rethink political community? How would you envision this? I know that's a big question, but you asked, I mean, you gave us big answers and questions. So, and Jamie, I was really interested in this concept of promiscuity. How did you say, promiscuous care?
Care, yeah.
Yes, and here I think it's kind of a traditional question in the literature on care, especially ethicists and philosophers of care, but like, are your responsibilities to care, do they depend on the proximity or promiscuity or distance that you have towards others? And you said, okay, we need to expand the circles of care. But as you know, care also needs skills, it needs work, it needs, so like, how do you manage, I think, this tension between the idea that promiscuity means that you have and care also, that you have a singular, very particular relation to the other that you treat as a person, and the idea that we need to expand towards, you know, people who are not in our closest circle of people, you know, promiscuous or proximate others. So how do we extend that towards more distant others? That would be my question. Thank you very much.
Shall
maybe,
I start?
Yeah, maybe let's go in the order of the
Okay.
speakers, if that's okay with everybody. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these very thoughtful questions. No, so I will link my answer to the second broader question to the one that you directed about self-care. Definitely, when we think about where the notion of care is located in this case, I'm not saying that this is a general rule. Again, I was looking at a certain type of correspondence. It is definitely linked first to the self, but also the fact that the relation enables this space to take place. Rather, not so much the idea of necessarily writing, because again, these women were doing it already. And so writing is an act of an individual kind of care. But definitely what the relationship to Audre Lorde brings is a sort of validation and being seen and acknowledged by somebody else in a context where these women lacked acknowledgement to some degree, right? So definitely what the relationship plays is the emotional sort of levering up the emotional well-being of knowing that what is said is being addressed and seen and read by somebody else. But it is hand in hand with a very individual practice, which is the one of writing. And again, this idea of kind of journaling, right, which is an individual practice. So in terms of, if we really think about space, I would really say it is introspective. It is something that looks at the mental, but also the emotional, right? So this kind of inner world, if we want to go into the more psycho-spiritual instance. And it's not to, it makes sense because these women in some instances also show some sort of spirituality, right? Whether it's linked to environment, whether it's interconnectedness, they don't necessarily talk about a god or a divinity, but they do talk about something that is very spiritual. And when we read Audre Lorde's texts, they are also very much spiritual. So this idea of an inner world and inner connection is not that far stretched. And so in that case, the responsibility of care, they take responsibility for themselves to do that. Well, I'm not even sure that they know it is taking the responsibility, they just do it. It is an act of self-preservation to some degree, depending on the violence and exclusion that is felt and experienced. So whether they are conscious of it or not, they do take the responsibility of taking care of their well-being in that instance. And again, applying into practice what Audre Lorde has theorized as the uses of language, right? And the creative uses, but first for the self, and then eventually to make a political comment. And so just to answer the second question, whether I saw any differences in language, whether they were straight or gay or depending on the race, not so much, I must say. In terms of sexuality, it was more like, well, it would be more the personal encounters of, you know, like what is happening in the couple, etc. But it did not, I could not see any influence on the aesthetic of writing, maybe the kind of issues that were put, of course, being Black and gay was different of being Black and straight, right? So that was definitely something that they had. The women who were, especially Black gay women, could have even more space of validation because Audre Lorde herself shared that positionality. And when it comes to race, then again, there are differences in the way of tackling the racism, because of course, as white women, they would position themselves more as allies. Then, of course, the women of color, and in this instance, mostly Black women, would be the direct victims of this oppression. So not so much in the aesthetic of languages, but more in the kind of topics that were mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to Amaya, I just want to encourage people in the public who want to ask questions after this first round is over to already use the Q&A box, so I can start to see how many questions we'll have and group them. Thank you. Amaya, it's your turn. Thanks.
Gracias. De nuevo, un reto, sintetizar la respuesta a esas tensiones que creo que han sido muy relevantes y pertinentes. En primer lugar, diría que creo que tenemos auténticos problemas de traducción entre idiomas y dentro de un mismo idioma. Entonces, dentro de un mismo idioma creo que estamos usando la palabra cuidados para referirnos a cosas muy distintas y que entonces pensamos que nos entendemos cuando no nos estamos entendiendo, no hablamos de lo mismo. Y esto se multiplica cuando además hablamos de tradiciones en distintas lenguas, donde hay una clarísima hegemonía del inglés. Entonces, por ejemplo, al mundo hispanohablante, lo que se escribe en inglés, no en francés hace años, no ahora, llega, pero no llega lo que se hace en español al mundo anglófono. En ese sentido, quería dar las gracias por este panel y por la posibilidad de traducción, porque no hay muchos espacios así, hay pocos. Entonces, de verdad agradecerlo, ¿no? Tenemos problemas de traducción, pero tenemos también problemas de sobredimensionamiento de un único concepto. Con cuidados pretendemos decirlo todo. Por eso yo decía que creo que tenemos que buscar también otras palabras, además de traducirnos, ¿no? Sobre la reproducción social que has nombrado, Leonor, a mí no me ha dado tiempo, pero efectivamente viene en parte de esa traducción. El planteamiento primero fue: no podemos hablar de producción de bienes y servicios por un lado y de reproducción de la vida por otro, porque lo que nos importa es el proceso transversal de reproducción de la vida, produciendo bienes y servicios en el mercado o en otros sitios. Pero para salir de la dicotomía se empezó a hablar de sostenibilidad de la vida. Ahora la pregunta es si quizá deberíamos retomar desde otro sitio la idea de reproducción. En segundo lugar, sobre dónde colocar los cuidados y la cuestión de la responsabilidad, que a mi juicio van claramente unidas. En primer lugar, hay que aclararnos de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de cuidados. Por ejemplo, creo que es muy distinto si hablamos de la atención a las situaciones donde la vulnerabilidad de la vida es mayor, como hablaba Jamie, por ejemplo, con el SIDA, o si hablamos del proceso cotidiano de sostener la vida de todas las personas en momentos de salud también. Primero, aclararnos. Segundo, ver dónde está a día de hoy. ¿Qué papel tienen dentro de este sistema que queremos cambiar distintos agentes y cuáles están sosteniendo vida y cuáles la están poniendo en riesgo? Para después poder decir dónde la queremos. Y aquí, rápido, solo querría decir que en el contexto del cual provengo, se está poniendo cada vez más énfasis en la idea de comunidad frente a la del estado de bienestar. Y ahí el juego, y esto es clave entre miradas más europeas y miradas de América Latina, cómo combinar los mecanismos del estado del bienestar con los mecanismos comunitarios. Ahí hay algo muy potente. Y el planteamiento de pasar a un sistema de relación más en espiral, desde la propia persona a las redes de convivencia, a la comunidad, a lo común y lo público entendido desde la idea de lo común. Yo creo que aquí la idea de la ética promiscua del cuidado podría jugar un papel. Y en tercer lugar, sobre la vulnerabilidad. Decir que, por ejemplo, para nosotras es útil distinguir la idea de vulnerabilidad como algo constitutivo de la vida de la idea de precariedad, que aparece cuando no ponemos redes colectivas para hacernos cargo de la vulnerabilidad. La vulnerabilidad es lo que nos unifica y la precariedad es lo que nos desiguala radicalmente en el marco de este sistema. Y en última instancia, sí, es fundamental para redefinir no solo las fronteras de las comunidades políticas, sino la apuesta política, porque la pregunta sobre la vulnerabilidad y cómo deriva o no en precariedad desigualmente repartida es la pregunta sobre qué vidas importan para el sistema o cómo podemos construir otro mundo donde todas las vidas en su diversidad importen, ¿no? Entonces sí está en el centro y además creo que nos permite salir de esa dicotomía entre injusticias de redistribución y de reconocimiento que sigue permeando en muchos contextos, creo. Bueno, lo dejo ahí. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Yes.
Yes. Okay, you can hear me. Yes. So I think the best way for me to address your questions is to, as best I can, perhaps give a kind of account of the manifesto, because I think each of the manifesto deals with the questions that you raise. So, so the manifesto is an attempt at speaking back to the various care crises, and we're not only interested in the actual hands-on care, what's traditionally understood as care, but we also have understood the environmental crisis as a crisis of care. We've also understood the refugee crisis as, you know, an important, you know, as a crisis of care too. And this is when I talked about the multiple crisis of care. These are all overlapping at particular points. And we locate the problem of the origins of these crises with one. I mean, and this is, you know, I've talked about and my other panel members have, is that care is something that's traditionally feminized and traditionally devalued, something I'm sure that everybody here will be familiar with, and also to a greater extent now racialized, right? And so it's complete. So this work, which is so vital in kind of keeping us and the world, the non-human world, alive, is just routinely kind of devalued and therefore associated with people who aren't white men. Okay, and this is intensified, we argue, under neoliberalism, where these inequalities are further kind of exacerbated, and care is only seen as meaningful if it can produce can be commodified and produce profit for companies that really don't care about the care work they're supposed to be involved in. And this has been grimly illustrated by the COVID crisis, particularly in the UK, where it's just been a disaster for a developed nation to have been dealing with it in the way that we have. And so the manifesto is a utopian vision, right? And in the truest sense of that word, to some degree, it's impossible, but it's a really important direction that we think we should move in. And the fundamental concept in that manifesto is this idea of universal care. And to some extent, that is an attempt at speaking back to social reproduction theory. And if Lynn was here, she would talk about how, you know, her involvement in second wave feminism and women liberation, the factions or the sections that she was involved in, was always suspicious of social reproduction theory, because if I'm representing her views correctly, she would say that social reproduction subsumes care once again to the logic of capital. And whilst it was really important in illustrating the vital role that women played in the functioning of society, there was a certain kind of ways that it understood care only in terms of what it was producing for the economy. And that actually she would argue, and we as a collective would argue, we need a much more radical idea of care. And so we have a broader sense of care as all the practices that are necessary for the flourishing of all of life. And things that Amaya have said have really resonated with the kind of the ways that we think about universal care, trying to move beyond the universal breadwinner model and Nancy Fraser's universal caregiving model. We need to kind of radicalize the notion of care, and universal care is an idea in which society is based on care at every scale of life. And through the manifesto, we go through what we identify as the scales of life. So I've spoken about care at the level of kinship, but we also look at communities, states, markets, and the world. So we're arguing against the prevalent ideas of care that it's, as Margaret Thatcher has famously said, and which has been a kind of organizing idea for neoliberalism, certainly in the UK and the US, is that there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals and their families. And implicit in that is a certain notion of where care is located. It's located within the individual and it's located at home. And that has been enormously destructive in a whole range of reasons. And so partially promiscuous care is saying that we need to move away from individualized notions of care, and that care only happens within the family and at most with your fellow citizens, although not really. She never, I mean, it's implicit within neoliberal, neoconservative politics that we care about our citizens, but it's never stated perhaps as explicitly as that. And so we have to apply universal care. It has to be the organizing principle of life at every scale. And so promiscuous care is partially thinking about the question of who. So it is precisely about moving away from the family, the mother, the child, these kind of racialized, feminized notions of care, and proliferating as widely as possible the idea of care. And as I'm speaking, and I remember you said that, and whilst you talked about care having a kind of, maybe you didn't say this, but often we think about care having a patient relation, an ongoing and enduring relationship with the other, and that's absolutely true and absolutely vital and needs to be resourced at every single level. But there are also ways that we think about care with relation to your question of proximity, where the question of in the care literature we also talk about caring about, and one of the things we argue in the manifesto is that we have to care about, for instance, the natural world as if it were our kin. We draw on Native American ontologies of care and kinship that looks at the kind of environmental world that they inhabit as if they were kin. We look at the kind of fights around the Dakota pipeline, the North Dakota pipeline, and the river that was involved in that. They understand it as a brother. And so it's utopian and it's very expansive, and it's a manifesto, so I think that's okay. But yes, certainly, I agree with you that it's about expanding this notion of care as widely as possible and away from more traditional understandings of how care is used in the literature. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. So I want to encourage, we still have, lunch is approaching fast, but we do have some time for questions. So there is a first question to Jamie from Magdalena, who asks you, or who says, and actually picks up just where you left with a kind of challenge. The idea of universality has been questioned by feminist and decolonial writers a lot. How do you bring that term back in with all its risks and consequences, which also I think Amaya pointed to in her own presentation.
Yeah,
so just maybe, Jamie, you can answer, and maybe Amaya wants also to answer to that.
Yes, no, I think that's a really good point. And perhaps the term is misleading in that way, because the way that the collective has developed the notion of care in the manifesto isn't in a singular way at all. We begin from the kind of intersectional critique of care as the way that it is currently universalized as something that really only women or feminized or racialized subjects should be doing. And so I think from the beginning, we problematized the kind of already universalizing notions of mainstream care. And then we think about care differently at every scale. So care looks different at the level of kinship to it does for a caring market, for instance. We talk about how market logics can never be reconciled to care logics, and there are ways of redistributing goods that are caring and are more in line with our idea of care. So I take that point, but we aren't developing a one model fits all based on an invisible subject. We are thinking about it differently, intersectionally, and with specificity at every scale. So yeah, perhaps the term hasn't got the idea. The term perhaps doesn't suggest that. But if you read the manifesto, Magdalene, we completely agree with you, and we argue it from a feminist and decolonial and kind of anti-human, kind of post-humanist kind of perspective. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Maya, do you want to react to this idea of maybe the scale, the scope,
Sí, es que lo que comentaba Jamie a mí me hilaba con, desde un contexto más hispanohablante, a veces hemos hablado de que la apuesta tiene que ser poner el cuidado en el centro, los cuidados en el centro de todo nuestro sistema. Pero yo creo que aquí es donde nos han venido los riesgos que decía antes, que al final hemos perdido mirada sistémica y hemos perdido también esa dimensión de conflictos multidimensionales. Entonces, creo que como palabra, digamos, como enunciación de una utopía puede ser bonita, puede ser movilizadora y potente, pero que luego al aterrizarlo nos vienen todos esos riesgos. Por ejemplo, a la hora de plantear cambios concretos desde esa idea de los cuidados en el centro, por ejemplo, hemos usado la idea de un derecho universal y multidimensional al cuidado. No solo a recibir, sino a poder dar en todos los momentos de la vida, pero para compañeras de América Latina nos decían, eso sigue siendo una lógica individualista y liberal de los derechos. Y si los cuidados nos hablan de una realidad de interdependencia, nunca los vamos a poder expresar en claves de derechos individuales. Entonces, nos vienen aquí todas las dificultades. Lo que yo diría es que hagamos lo que hagamos, tenemos que intentar no perder mirada sistémica, de nuevo, porque esto a veces suena muy bien, pero ¿qué papel les damos a las empresas y a los mercados? ¿De qué mercados hablamos? Porque en una sociedad que ponga los cuidados en el centro, yo diría que no pueden existir empresas capitalistas, pero no suele ser lo que nos atrevemos a decir desde ahí. Entonces, mirada sistémica, mirada en conflicto interseccional y con el cuerpo y la vida como el punto de partida y el punto de llegada siempre. Y desde ahí, pues vamos intentándolo juntas, ¿no? No sé, con las equivocaciones y los aciertos que vayamos teniendo.
Yeah, so maybe a follow-up on those thoughts and the last question that we'll have time to. Do you want to, Pamela? Do you want to add now or after the?
Sorry about that. On the idea of universality, and this is not based on the correspondence. It's based on my own practice, being part of Black women's collectives, where of course the notion of care, self-care, is very prominent, and my position on that. Also drawn from experience would be that there needs to be an acknowledgement of who has the space and the means and the resources to take care of. And that puts also the responsibility of care on the people who are in more privileged positions. Because in practice, we see that, let's say a group of minority people organizing and thinking that they also need to be caring for each other at the same time usually puts a double burden on having to fight against something and also caring for our peers, etc. So it's like, again, to whom is the burden? And so one of the ideas that I share is that, well, know where your resources of care are. If you are, let's say, example, a Black woman dating a person who is in a more privileged position, then that person should know that your daily struggles are not the same as that person's. And so that person should be a bit more caring that he or she may have more resources to be caring for you. So that's something that on a very basic practical level, I apply, which breaks down this idea that everybody should be caring at all times, right?
No, great. I think it resonates very well with the last question, and maybe you'll have a little bit more to say on that point as well, which is from Molly, and I'm going to sum up here, but saying, you know, I'm wondering about the power dynamics that are reproduced also within communities which are supposed to be caring communities. So she says, how do we address this within communities, and how do we build communities that are anti-racist, anti-cis, het-normative, anti-ableist? And so then she gives her own example in Denmark and concludes, are communities and community care always the answer to the Death Star? I love the Star Wars metaphor here, neoliberal capitalist care model. So I think that also totally resonates with what you said, Pamela, and also with Amaya really emphasizing the idea of conflict. So if all of you want to say like a very short point on this, and maybe Pamela, you start, and then Amaya and Jimmy will conclude.
Sure. I think that for now, there has been too much of sort of, you know, it's either we do everything collectively or we do everything on an individual basis. And I really think also, again, from my own experience, that there needs to be a balance between both. There is a need for, as much as everybody can, take responsibility for themselves and not always give up the power to others. So in entering a collective, it is up to everybody to do their own check, self-check. So, okay, are we bringing in, because of course, if we're fighting against violence, chances are that this structural violence does penetrate us in some way, because we are always in this, you know, having to fight back. So there can be instances where doing the work of functioning completely different from the society that we're in might take practice, might take some time, etc. So there's always this balance that needs to be figured out between taking responsibility for oneself from time to time when entering whichever collective, and then knowing that, okay, when am I being beneficial to the collective, and when do I have the resources to give to the collective, and when do I need to step back and figure out that, okay, I actually need resources and need to get those resources and step back for myself. And that's also a very philosophical, there's a tendency to say that African societies are very drawn to the collective, but I've been reading a lot about it. And there's also this idea that the collective depends on the well-being of each individual. So if people who enter a collective are completely messed up, then of course it has an impact on the collective. So I really think that this balance is important. And again, self-responsibility for each of us, depending on the position we're in.
Yes, and I think, as Amaya mentioned, care can also be about control, especially in a collective setting, right? So there's power issues here. Amaya, do you want to say a few words on this issue as well?
Son todo cuestiones muy interesantes y complejas. Yo creo que tenemos un reto enorme en pensar la comunidad, lo que hay compañeras que llaman entramados comunitarios, como una apuesta distinta a la institución propia del sistema que queremos cambiar, ¿no? Y que para aprender de aquí, creo que la mirada tiene que ir a lugares que han conseguido mantener más vínculos comunitarios en el despliegue de este modelo no solo neoliberal, sino la modernidad capitalista, sin idealizar, porque efectivamente, ¿de qué comunidades hablamos? O sea, ¿hablamos de comunidades cerradas o hablamos de comunidades diversas, inclusivas, porosas, en contagio unas con otras? Entonces, creo que aquí tenemos una pregunta central que no tengo capacidad de resolver, solo de señalar, recalcar su importancia. Y creo que es más central todavía porque vamos a vivir tiempos, yo diría, en ese contexto de crisis multidimensional que Jamie hablaba y de colapso ecológico, de desglobalización y de volver a acercar los procesos más al territorio. Los territorios creo que van a ir adquiriendo una centralidad enorme y van a estar en disputa. ¿Qué territorios? ¿Quién los va a definir y qué tipo de comunidades los van a habitar? Entonces aquí tenemos un elemento central y en ese llamado que hacía a hablar más allá de los cuidados, la cuestión de lo común, comunitario, comunidad, entramados comunitarios son uno de los elementos clave, creo.
Jamie, if you want to react really quickly to this challenge of conflict and power within the communities, and then we'll be able to close the panel because we're running a little bit late.
Okay, I was going to say a couple of things, but I'll just say one thing then. One of the best conceptual resources that I'm aware of that I think can help us think about this really important question is from Neera Yuval Davis, who writes about intersectionality, but she's also written about transversal politics. And so this question of transversality, of recognizing that we are all differently situated within the communities that we inhabit, that those different situations, located, I forget how she phrases it, the where we are situated is in very complex kind of power relations. And as Pamela said, there's always people, you know, with greater privilege than others. But a transversal politics, she argues, is the recognition of our different situatedness and that we can work together across those different power relations. And so to work transversely, to develop transversal politics within these communities is the method by which we can begin to think about resolving some of these issues. Obviously, I don't think these issues are ever resolvable. The collective thinks in utopian terms, but there are no utopian solutions. It's very difficult to bring these to life, but thinking transversely, acknowledging where you are in relation to intersectional kind of structures, acknowledging your different power positions and working with those things in mind, I think is a useful way of thinking about of Molly's question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the public for their patience, and sorry for having gone a little bit overboard, but thank you very much for the panelists for engaging so deeply and earnestly with all this very important issue in an amount of time that was ridiculously too short. And I think, Miriam, maybe you want to say a word about the next panel?
Yes, first of all, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for your superb moderation and your input to the discussion. Thank you for our panelists. And I think it was really important also to problematize care, to connect care to notions of social reproduction, to move beyond these two concepts that have been central in the Anglo-American world, and also to open up conversations with the very rich theoretical production that has been going on in Latin America and in the Hispanic world right now. And thanks to Maya to discussing the concept of sustainability of life. I just want to thank everyone, the translation team. And I would like to remind you that the last event of this conference will be a workshop this afternoon at 2:30 p.m., a workshop on care as method. So thank you so much, everyone. And I know that we will try to do a sort of clapping. I'm not sure how it's going to work. We can clap. I'm not sure how the participants can clap.
I think the participant can unmute themselves, and we can coordinate to clap. In Amaya, Amaya and Jimmy, you have to unmute yourself. Yes, thanks. Okay, so 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
for the
Jenny. I see that you have to run.
I
Goodbye.
do. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
J'arrête.
Ah oui, oui, tu peux arrêter l'enregistrement.